Hello, and welcome to English 346, the survey of British literature from the Romantics to the present. This first lesson is going to cover Romantic poetry and fiction. Poetry was the most prominent form of literature during the Romantic period, but fiction was also very important. So we're going to look at some early examples of each of those. We'll also talk about the slave trade, which, as tragic as it was, is important to know about and important cultural background for understanding the Romantic period. It's one of a number of significant historical events that informs our understanding of the Romantic period. So these are the topics we're going to cover in the first lesson. I'd also like to real quickly note um, something about the structure of the class and these lessons. Each lesson has 4 parts, and they will be separate videos so as not to overwhelm you with too much information at first. That way you can take a break in between the various parts of the lecture, maybe watch them on different days or different times, come back to them throughout the week, just kind of break it up for you a little bit. The reason they're divided into 4 parts, the reason why 4 is the number, is each part is supposed to represent an hour class session during a regular quarter. So normally we would meet 2 days a week for 2 hours, and we'd have a break in between those 2 hours, and there'd usually be 2 topics for each 2-hour block class, 1 topic per hour. And so each lesson is meant to encapsulate a week of class, with the 4 parts equaling to the 4 hours of class we'd normally have. And so that's why each lesson has 4 parts. Along those lines, to give you an idea of how long the lectures will be, I promise total volume of time between the 4 parts to not at any point exceed 2 hours. It will usually be much less than that. This first one will definitely be the longest and the closest to 2 hours because, in addition to the literature, we're also going to cover the syllabus and what you need to know for class. So the first part of this 4-part lesson 1 will be equivalent to that first half of that first day of class where we go over the syllabus. So that's what makes this first lesson and this first part of this first lesson a little bit longer. But again, how it matches up to what a normal class, not online, would be like. So here we go. That's the overview. Here we go. Again, the first part of this 4-part lesson is introducing you to the course. So in addition to covering the background of the Romantics, we'll also go over the syllabus, my teaching philosophy, what the course is all about, the graded work, that kind of really important information that we'd go over the first day of class on the syllabus. So here are some tips I have for success with online learning. I've been teaching online classes going all the way back to 2012, so 7 years. And brick and mortar class where you meet in the classroom is designed to help you through the process where you're coming to class a couple days a week. Your professor, your classmates are there to help keep you on track. You don't necessarily have all the same resources, or they're not available to you in the same manner. So I want to take a minute and go over what you can do to help yourself with online classes. The first is manage your time well. So the first week of class, give yourself a lot of time to do the readings, to do the assignments, probably the first few weeks of class until you get used to about how long that work takes you. And then make sure you have that amount of time set aside each week to do the work. Don't wait to do it. Don't try to cram it in. Treat it like a regular class where you have class every few days and you have things due each week. Don't treat it as something where everything is due at the end, because if you do, you'll never be able to get it done. So I have weekly due dates to help you stay on track. Come up with a schedule where you reserve time to work on the class throughout the week. So if it takes you, 2 hours usually to do the readings, pick a day, say Tuesday from 8 to 10, because you get off work at 7. You come home, you have dinner, you've got 2 hours set aside to do the reading. Do the same thing with the discussion board posts on another day and watching the lectures, so on and so forth. Again, it might take you a week or 2 to figure all that out, so give yourself a lot of leeway, a lot of time at first. Finally, stay up on due dates and reading assignments and try to work ahead if possible. Again, with an online class, most of the content is available when the class starts, so you can work ahead if you ever have extra time. And then, like I said, there will be due dates all throughout the quarter. So stay up on those. Try not to fall behind. If you ever do need an extension, email me. We can work something out. But try not to do that if you can help it. Try to keep up with all the due dates and get everything in on time, because things move at kind of an accelerated pace in an online class, because you don't have those bi-weekly class meetings to kind of keep you grounded in the class. You have to keep turning in this work and motivating yourself. There's a lot of self-motivation. So if you fall behind, if you miss an assignment, I give you an extension, it can be harder to catch up perhaps than in a regular class. So really try your best to stay up on all those due dates and reading assignments. All right, those three suggestions I just gave you really apply to any online class you take. Now I'm going to give you some that are specific to this class. So read carefully. This is a literature class. The majority of the work for the class is reading. So, if you eyes glaze over a passage, we all have that moment where we're reading, especially with some of this high canonical literature from a couple hundred years ago. We're reading, we stop, we say, what just happened in that paragraph? Don't move on, reread that passage. One thing I've learned over those years is those passages I zone out during, oftentimes they end up being the most important ones. So go back, reread them. Read the footnotes. It's easy to skip the footnotes, especially when you have a lot to read, but sometimes a really helpful, important cultural context that helps you understand the literature comes through the footnotes. So read those. And then take notes as you read. Highlight the important passages, take notes on them in the margins. A really good strategy I've found is paraphrasing the reading in my own words. So at the end of a paragraph or important section, I might write in the margin 1 or 2 sentences that is me explaining to myself what I just read. I can't tell you how much that helps me interpret these high canonical works. Watch the lectures. Similarly, watch the lectures carefully. So, don't treat it like a movie. I mean, you can enjoy a meal or something maybe during it, but pay close attention, take notes as if you were in class. Pause them, if you need more time to take notes. And a lot of times I'll put questions on the screen. I'll usually answer them, but, pause it and maybe try to answer the question first yourself. We do the best we can in an online class to replicate the classroom environment and that kind of those kind of discussions that happen there that are so productive, but we can only do so much. And this is one way. So in other words, be actively engaged with the lecture, even though it's a recording, as much as you can, in a manner similar to you would engage with a class discussion or lecture. Finally, another thing I've learned over the years, and there's research to back this up, is that writing something down is much more helpful to remembering it than just reading it, hearing it, or even seeing it. So taking notes during the lectures, taking notes while you're reading, that's going to help you retain this information. Okay, now I'm going to give you a breakdown of each weekly lesson. So there's, as I said before, 4 reading assignments equivalent to 4 hours of class each week. A Monday through Friday class, we'd meet 4 times and take a day off. A 2-hour class, we would have 2 reading assignments per class, 1 for each hour. So these lessons and reading assignments are structured the same way. Hopefully that helps you as you're reading the syllabus and the reading list. And then once you go in and you start actually doing the work, here's the order of things you should do. First, the reading, and then watch the lecture. The reason I said do the reading first is I don't want my interpretation of literary works informing yours until after you've had a chance to read them and have your own observations, impressions, reactions. If you want to go back and reread them after the lecture and you have time, I would recommend that. But if you're only going to read it once, do that before watching the lecture. We do have a reading quiz for each lesson, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. And then we have a discussion board for each lecture as well. And I call the discussion board Threads and Thesis. Again, the next part of this lesson, this video lecture here, is a breakdown of the graded assignments. So we're going to go into the more detail on those in just a second. All right, for the reading quizzes, if you look at the syllabus, and I should have said this earlier, but now that we're at this point in the video, the rest of this lecture, until we get to the background on the romantics, it really goes through the syllabus and explains the things on there. So if you don't already have it open, I would recommend pausing the video and in another tab going into Canvas and opening up the syllabus so that you can follow along. So pause it now and do that. Okay, now that you have your syllabus open, what I'd recommend is going to the section that's graded work. And if you look at the graded work, you'll see it's divided into two categories. Spot check, which is worth 20% of your grade, and then creativity, which is worth 80%. You're going to go into more detail on both of those now. So the spot check is worth much less. You can tell by those way those grades are broken up, I really value creativity. That's part of my teaching philosophy. So the spot check is exactly what it sounds like. It's just a way to make sure you're doing the reading. And really the only way to assess that is in the form of reading quizzes. So here's what the reading quizzes are. Each module will include one reading quiz, and those are the only things for the spot check. You don't have any other spot check assignments. So that 20% of your grade will be the 10 reading quizzes for the 10 modules or lessons. Here's what's on each quiz. You won't know the questions till you start the quiz. That's normal. I don't think anyone gives them to you ahead of time. You have 2 hours to complete the quiz, so you can take it anytime you want. If you're working ahead or you may be doing it earlier in the week in your classmates, that's fine. There's not a certain window where it's available, but once you start it, you only have 2 hours to finish it. It is open book and open note. This is not meant to be a way to make the class difficult for you. This is just a chance for me to make sure you're doing your reading. So, what I would recommend is in a separate tab as you're doing the quiz, have the lecture open so you can rewatch it, skip to certain parts, and then have your textbook and your notes in front of you as well. And then finally, the questions are all short answer. And so each response should be a minimum of 150 words. That's not that much. You'll end up maybe writing like 2 or 3 pages, less than that actually, worth of material to answer these questions. So it's pretty short. It's not too challenging. It's a question that basically through your answer, I'll know if you've done the reading, watched the lecture, and been paying attention, engaging with the class, which is exactly what a spot check would be. So what might you ask? So you might ask, what should be in a quiz answer? So here's this format. This information is listed on each quiz assignment as well. A clear and direct response to the question. So don't beat around the bush. Just in the first sentence, it's a quiz. It's not an essay. You don't need to give background and context. In the first sentence, just answer the question. And that can read like a thesis statement. Here's my answer to the question. A quote from the literary text. So I want to see you prove your answer through close reading. We're going to talk a lot about close reading. But when making claims and assertions about literature, the best way to prove your argument is through close reading. And so close reading is not analysis of plot. Even good analysis of plot is still not close reading. Close reading is when you look at the actual language from the text. So a quote, explaining how that quote proves your answer, is the best way to support a thesis when writing about literature. We'll talk about why that's the case more later on. So a clear and direct response to the question, a quote from the literary text, and finally several sentences where you explain how the quote supports your answer. So not just answer and quote, but answer, quote, and then most importantly, a few sentences where you say how that quote proves your answer. And that's the crux, that's the crucial part. So now that you have this format, what I want to do is an example. So I'm going to give you a sample question. This will not be on any of your quizzes, but it does address the readings from lesson 1. So if you follow the directions, you'll already be familiar with this text I'm posing the question about. Right, so here's the sample question. How does Wordsworth's poem, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, represent the themes of the Romantic period? So this is the example of the type of question I give. It's not that there's only one right answer, but it is a quiz. You do have to know the Romantic period, and you do have to know this poem. So hopefully that kind of gives you an idea of the type of questions I'll be asking. And now here's the kind of response I'm looking for. I'm not saying you have to have a response exactly like this, but I'm just trying to give you kind of the formula, the format for the responses. So that's what you should pay attention to here. So a direct answer would be something along the lines of, Wordsworth's poem, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, represents the romantic themes of a connection to nature, spontaneity, and the impulse of feeling when the speaker experiences a transcendent moment with nature. So I have a direct answer. I list 3 themes here that come straight from the textbook's introduction to Romanticism. I also take a clear stance. Other people might disagree with this, so it reads like a thesis statement. Also, like a thesis statement, I give a rationale or a because of reason. I say, when the speaker experiences a transcendent moment with nature. So these 3 romantic themes are encapsulated by his interaction with nature in the poem. So that's an example of what your first opening sentence could be like, a very direct answer to the question. You see that how it asks me to identify themes of the romantic period in this poem, and my answer lists those 3 themes. All right, so now I'll go into a little more detail. Here's a quotation I've picked from this poem. I'll read it real quickly. We're going to do a lot of reading aloud of poetry during the lessons because close reading is so important. For oft when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which in the bliss of solitude, and then my heart with pleasure fills, and dances me with the daffodils. Okay, so the speaker's ability, these would be my then few sentences. I have 3 sentences here that would then explain the quote and how it proves my answer. The speaker's ability to recall a transcendent moment with nature when feeling vacant and subsequently become joyous at the recollection of the moment illustrates the significance of that moment and of nature to the romantics. So in the poem, the speaker envisions himself as a cloud and he sees these daffodils. And so I'm saying here, his ability then later on, when he's feeling not well, to recall that moment and for it to raise his spirits, that's this very romantic idea of transcendent moment with nature. As we'll talk about later on, nature was very much a spiritual thing for the Romantics. That's one of the key things that defines that literary movement. So I go on and explain, I guess, what I just said. The natural world was incredibly important to many of the Romantics because they believed that interaction with nature could provide this type of transcendent, nearly spiritual moment during an age of political oppression. So I'm explaining not only that nature is in this poem and important to the Romantics, but why it was important to the Romantics. So I'm showing the professor, in this case, which is also me, but I'm showing the professor that I really understand the Romantic movement. It was a time where there was a lot of political oppression, and the laws being passed were very, very stringent and strict. And so that in part led to this freedom, this spiritual kind of experience in nature. So I'm going in a little more depth, and I'm not just saying these are romantic values. I'm saying this is why these things are romantic values, and we see them in the poem. So the question is getting at my understanding of romanticism, and so I'm really trying to show that through my answer here. Finally, I wrap up my thoughts. In a spontaneous moment driven by his feelings, the speaker has this type of spiritual experience with nature that lifts his spirits. And so I connected back to spontaneity and feeling, which are 2 of the other things I mentioned in my initial answer, in addition to nature, as 3 themes of romanticism. And I tie everything together, wrap it up nicely is my goal there. In a similar question, you would not have to address 3 themes of romanticism. 1 would be fine. This was just in attempting to write out an answer to my own question. That's what I came up with. As long as you answer the question clearly and directly and show your knowledge of what the question's assessing, in this case, romanticism in this particular poem, because this poem is short and easy to analyze, but really emblematic of the Romantic movement as a whole. This is the exact type of question I would ask to assess your understanding of romanticism on a quiz. So hopefully this gives you an idea of what I'm looking for. Direct answer, short quote, short explanation of the two. 150 words is good. You can write more if you want. A real quick note on the grading. Each quiz will have 4 questions like this, corresponding to the 4 parts of the lecture. Each question will be worth 10 points, so each quiz will be worth 40 points total. It'll be, most of the time, I think you'll probably get 100%, would be my guess. If you know the material, you've done the reading, you've taken good notes, I'd be shocked if you didn't get 100%. And I'm not a harsh grader in that sense. Again, it's exactly what I've said, just a spot check to see that you know the stuff. So I'll normally just give you the points. The only time I'd actually make comments in terms of feedback would be if you didn't get the full credit. I would explain why, and those comments would give you an idea of how to improve for the next quiz. All right. So I want to move on to creativity. In one part of the creativity section of the graded work will be the threads and thesis assignments, which is the discussion board for the class. Most online classes have a discussion board, but in my class, it takes the shape of something I call threads and thesis. And so that might be kind of a new thing for you unless you've taken the class with me before. So I want to take a few minutes here and explain to you exactly what that is. Like I said before, creativity is the other 80% of the final grade. With the quizzes, the spot check, you show me what you've learned. In this section there, creativity is a chance for you to teach me, which I really value. I think that's the more fun part of the class. So it'll take the form of 2 critical analysis papers. I'm not going to go over those now. They'll be pretty similar to papers you've written if you've taken other upper division literature classes before. In lesson 5, which is the lesson right before the first paper is due, I'm going to go over the requirements, examples, etc. for the critical analysis papers in detail. But they're already up on Canvas, so you can read the directions, and even a sample paper from a past class of a student who did well is also up. So you can look at all of that now. And in lesson 5, I'll go over those things in greater detail. Okay, so the other 20% within this 80% of creativity is threads and thesis, and this is the discussion board. So rather than just answering a question, that's what you're doing on the quizzes. Most discussion boards and other classes ask you to just answer a question. I want you essentially to come up with the question. I want to see creativity here. In threads and thesis, I call it TNT for short. Hopefully that helped you remember it. TNT, dynamite. You can sing the AC/DC song in your head to remember. That reference is probably going to give you some indication of how old I am. Anyway, threads and thesis, I think, are just a great way. I learned this from another professor when I was in grad school, but a great way to facilitate students interpreting the literary works, which is the ultimate goal, for you to interpret them and come up with your own interpretations about what they mean and why they're significant. So the TNT is designed to help facilitate you doing that. Okay, so what are threads? First of all, threads are interesting observations you make while reading that are worth pursuing in more detail. So this can be anything. A pattern, a repeated symbol, an idea, an image, something that stands out when you're reading that you think is important. So this can be very brief. It's just an observation. But the threads, these observations, are fundamental to our process of reading and interpreting the literary work. And so there's a 3-part structure here I'm about to go over that really can inform any reading of literature, and it's really how we interpret literature. I've just given a name to it with this threads and thesis thing. And so you'll actually see me doing this myself, modeling this for you as you watch the lectures and I go over the literary works. But I'm only going to go over some of what's there. These literary works have so much depth. There's a lot to interpret, so you'll be doing your own readings here. Again, that's why it's creativity, but I'm going to model that for you. So in terms of this 3-step process, you start with these interesting observations, which I call threads. And the thread is a metaphor. So you pull on the thread, and that means you pursue it in more detail. So you read the work, maybe you find some interesting pattern. there's a continual reference to something. Maybe the word, for instance, maybe the word blood is used over and over again. So that stands out. So you make a note of that. That's a thread. Then what do? You pull on the thread. So you go back, you look at each passage you've highlighted that uses the word blood, and you start to see why the author is using the word blood over and over again. So just like if you pulled on a thread, say in a garment or a blanket, that thing would start to come undone as you pull on the thread. You pull on the thread here, it starts to unravel what the literary work is about. Finally, if you go deep enough in your analysis of the literary work, you can take a stance or make a thesis statement, a claim about what the meaning of the text is. So for the example, you start out as you read, you notice you're maybe a couple pages in, you notice the author has used the word blood 3 or 4 times already. So you say, this must be important. So you highlight those times. As you continue reading, you continue to highlight it, you know more what to look for. Then you pull on the thread. You look at all those instances of the word blood. You start to kind of see what's going on. Finally, you can make a claim. The author uses the repetition of the word blood to do blank, fill in the blank, such and such. There's your thesis. So again, this formula, it should be exactly that, a formula to kind of help take you through the steps to analyzing literature. I have some sample threads and thesis here from a student who's taken class with me before. So here's one from Chinua Achebe's story, Dead Man's Path. The student says the barbed wire symbolizes the struggle between modern society's acceptance of traditional culture. So, seems important. There's not a lot of detail, but it's something they've noticed. The barbed wire seems to symbolize this. You could go back, read that in more detail, and maybe eventually make a claim about modern society's struggle with traditional culture, more specific. Here's another one. The couple in this story, A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, are poor and desperate, which leads to their initial mistreatment of the winged old man. And then this leads the student to a question. Why does the couple continue to mistreat the old winged man even after they have gotten rich off of him? So a really interesting question, right? Answering that question could potentially be a thesis. So then I've just given you a couple examples to illustrate what a thread is. Here's now a thesis the student then, this is student works, not mine, developed from that thread we just saw on A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings. So the student goes on to say that the couple get nothing but good fortune and miracles from the winged old man, yet they mistreat him because he is not exactly the miracle they wanted. So there's a little disappointment there. That answers the question from the thread. The student is pulled on the thread and is thinking further. This leads the student to another question. Did they react this way? Is that a natural response or a nurtured response? So the nature versus nurture question ends up being what the student wants to focus on for this paper, this thesis. But they still have a question. So it's not quite at the point where a thesis in the paper would be. You don't want to pose a question for a thesis in an actual paper. But they're much closer to a thesis than they were when they just had the thread. You can see how they've answered the question from the thread, and that's led them to an even more important, more challenging thesis. So this is a good place to be for the threads and thesis you turn into Canvas. But then in between doing that, in writing an actual paper, you could then answer the question through research, through further analysis of the literary work, etc. So, in other words, these thesis statements you write in your weekly discussion board can actually be a draft, a stepping stone to a really great thesis for your paper. So they don't need to be the most polished thesis statements. They do need to have potential. And this way you have a repository of a number of thesis statements you can choose from when you go to write your paper, which gives you a really good start. And that's another goal of this assignment, is to give you a start to your thesis statements. All right, and that's what I say here. You would then answer the question in your paper, but this is a good start. And with the threads and thesis, the number of students in the class, the number of views you'll be writing, I won't be able to make detailed comments on each one, but I will read them all. And so if you have a thesis that really shows potential, that really stands out, I will make some quick comments, and I'll give you some suggestions for where to go next. But if I'm making the comments, and I'll acknowledge this, but if I'm making the comments in the first place, that means you have enough good material there that it's a very good thesis to choose to work with for the paper. So keep that in mind as we go through the course and as I grade these. And you can always email me your thesis statements leading up to when the paper is due for feedback. In fact, I'd recommend that. Excuse me. So now that we've covered all the grading work, I'd actually like you to scroll back up in the syllabus, and we're going to talk about my teaching philosophy, what I believe about the class. Now, the course catalog for EWU says that this is supposed to be a survey of British literature from the Romantics to the present, but that's bare bones. What are we doing with that? Now, in any literature class I teach, the content is very important. What's happening in the literature is very important. And in a survey class like this is perhaps even more important than in other classes, because you're supposed to know these major authors and know these major works as part of your background as a literary studies or creative writing or education major. But as important as that content is, in any literature class I teach, I think the framework or the methodology for analyzing literature is the most important part. You do need to know the Romantics and the Victorians and other writers by this time the class is over. You do need to know William Blake and Thomas Hardy. But if you have no way of interpreting William Blake and Thomas Hardy when this class is over, then I have failed in my job. And so what's even more important than learning William Blake and Thomas Hardy is learning how to interpret William Blake and Thomas Hardy in a way that you can then look at another author, say F. Scott Fitzgerald, who we're not studying in this class, and also interpret that author. You may be teaching your high school students one day William Blake, and you can go look up or research a lot of the content type things I teach you. But if you just put the text of one of William Blake's poems in front of you, I want you by the time this class is over to know how to interpret that poem. So right now I'm going to give you a framework, a methodology, if you will, for interpreting all literature. It's that general. It's based on my belief from my teaching philosophy that cultures influence literature while literature simultaneously influences culture. I have a diagram in a few minutes that'll explain this better. But basically, no writer is disconnected from the world in which they live. The world, the culture, the history they live in influences their writing. But at the same time, the literature they produce can influence the world. So, give you examples for both sides of it. If you do any writing of your own, you know whatever's happening in the world around you influences your writing to some degree. We live in a world of technology, social media. That probably has some impact on the writing you do. Similarly, one of the poets we're going to study in this course, Percy Shelley, said that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. In other words, writing can create change. And the best example I have of this is Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel in American literature, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which Abe Lincoln attributed to help being a catalyst for the Civil War. He said, when he met Harriet Beecher Stowe, he said, during the Civil War, he met her and he said, "Here's the little lady that started this all." Now, there's a lot going into what started the Civil War, obviously, but a novel about the injustices and oppression of slavery that was very popular and wide-reaching and influenced a lot of people is certainly one of the factors that led to the start of the Civil War. And we'll see that more when we talk about the literature of abolition in Great Britain during this lecture. But as you can tell from what I'm saying, culture, the world around a writer, influences that writer, but the writer can also shape the world around them, and this creates change. So this view of literature and culture as having a cyclical relationship, a mutually influential relationship, helps us see how to interpret it. So we start by looking at historical factors. What is the background and context that informs this literary work? I don't believe you can study literature without looking at that. Some professors do, and so this is my theory. That's important to keep in mind, but that's how we'll approach it in this class. Next, you look at the philosophy or the content. So what is the literature actually saying? And finally, what do we learn from this literature? So what has shaped the literature? What is the message of the literature? What does it actually say? And what do we learn from it? So an easy way to remember this is context, content, and learning. And if you apply this to any piece of literature, you'll do really well. You go into it, I'm going to do a little bit of research, kind of find out what informs this. Okay, I'm going to read it, interpret it. What does it mean? Okay, now why does this matter? Why did I just read this? If I'm teaching it to students, I need to be able to say what's important about it. So here's just kind of a diagram. Makes me look like a Chicago Bears fan. That was unintentional. I'm an Arizona Cardinals fan. But anyway, here's just kind of a diagram to show you that cyclical, mutually influential relationship between literature and culture. I say cultures, plural, because there's more than one culture. There's British cultures, Caribbean cultures, American cultures, Indian cultures, different cultures within those, etc. Here's 5 questions derived from this philosophy that you can ask any literature text when reading it. What do I need to know to understand this text? So that's the background and context. What is the main theme, message, or central idea? So that's the content. What can we learn from this text? What does it offer value? Why does it matter? Why should we study it? Those are the learning questions. And then 2 general questions I think you can ask about any text is, what about this text is unique or specific to its time and culture? So that cultural influence. How can you tell that a romantic text was produced in Great Britain in the early 19th century? Every text will have indicators that tell you that. And in this sense, a literary text is a gateway, a doorway into learning more about a specific time, place, and culture. Another question you can ask is, what is universal or transcends this text? Even if it's written in Great Britain in the early 19th century, how can it appeal to a 21st century person in Switzerland, for instance? And this is, I think, what really defines great literature. Something we'll talk about if we have time in this class is, how have these literary works come to be chosen in the Norton Anthology? What makes them great and what separates them from other pieces of literature that can or should be considered great? And that's widely debated. But I think whether you agree that those works should be in the Norton Anthology and other works have or other works have been excluded that should be in there, whatever your feelings about that, this can and should be the criterion for choosing them. There has to be something about the work that transcends its time and place. Time and place are important to interpreting it, but for it to truly be great literature, there also has to be something about it that transcends its time and place. And what is that universal theme? That's what we learn from it. That's the so what factor. That's the answer to the pedagogical or learning question. So take note of these. I hope they will bless you and help you as you go forward and you read literature in this class and other classes, and then maybe teach it or write it one day. I hope these questions will be helpful. For me, they've been incredibly instrumental and helpful in my own studies of literature. Okay, so for the final little section of this first lesson, we're going to go over the background on Romanticism. And so if you look in the textbook, there's a good, 30-page introduction to Romanticism. I've assigned that as the first reading, aside from the syllabus, for this class, and it's very important. It's really going to help you understand the things we're reading. Romanticism, in my opinion, is kind of a strange time in literature, but really interesting, fascinating one. So knowing a little bit about it before you read all of it is really key, really clutch. Okay, here we go. So one of the first things that comes up with Romanticism is difficulty in dating this time period of this literary movement. So some important dates that have helped inform how scholars have tried to date it before start with the French Revolution in 1789. Romanticism is really marked by rebellion, revolution, this kind of individual spirit, the belief that everyone should be free. And so the French Revolution is seen in many ways as a catalyst for that. In 1832, the first reform bill was passed in Great Britain. And the reform bills, some were helpful, some were very oppressive, and so the reform bills marked kind of a tightening up of things that clashed in a sense then with this individual rebellious view the Romantic poets and writers held. And much of the Victorian literature that we'll read in the next section of the course started to be produced in the 1830s and 1840s. So a lot of scholars like to use this 1832 date to mark the end of the Romantic period. The Victorian period, which we'll study next, follows the 75 years or so time Queen Victoria was Queen of England. And so her ascension to the throne is also used as a possible end date for Romanticism. And we'll learn more about Queen Victoria and the Victorian period starting in lesson 4. And you'll really see why a lot of scholars use that as a possible end date. So here are some other possible, here are the dates kind of listed out. So 1789 to 1832 is kind of the shortest, most direct dating. 1789 to 1837 would be the next one, and you can clearly see this from what I have up above. Some scholars, including those who edited our textbook, like to go back as far as 1785. And I've met a lot of Romantic scholars over the years. My PhD is in Victorian studies, so I'm an expert really in the whole 19th century and the periods before and after the Victorian period, but the Victorian period the most. That's where I'm really an expert. But I've met a lot of Romantic PhDs over the years, and the ones I've met recently really like to say 1750 to 1850 because they just love Romanticism. So they want to include as much as possible. So that's the longest set of dates I've seen. But this whole issue of dating it, why it's important, is it's really actually representative of the Romantic period, of that literary movement, because it was this short, very emotionally intense period. And it itself, the Romantic authors, they would never want to be cataloged or strictly defined in any way. So this trouble with dating it really is emblematic of that time and of those writers' beliefs. Okay, so here are some of the themes of the Romantic period. I have an acronym, NERESA, which I believe really encapsulates the Romantic period. So if you can remember this acronym, NERESA, and memorize that, it's like a mnemonic device, you'll know Romanticism. So this is what it stands for. Nature, imagination, revolution, emotion, spontaneity, alienation. These are the themes that I think are most important to the Romantics. And let's talk about each of these in a little more detail. First, we should probably clear up the confusion of big R versus little r. What's the difference between Romanticism, the literary movement of the late 18th and early 19th century, and romance, those books you see at the grocery store, in the checkout line where the guy has his shirt off? What's the difference between Romanticism and romance? Well, big R Romanticism, the literary movement, did grow out of romance, specifically in that the Romantic writers sought a revival of medieval romances. If you've taken the other British literature surveys and you know the medieval romances, things like Lanval by Marie de France, for instance, I think you'll see what I mean. And so they thought that romance literature in general had some of these things, the imagination, emotion, spontaneity, and they wanted to bring those back. The Romantic period followed the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment was all about, again, if you've taken the earlier classes, you'll know, but the Enlightenment was all about the rational mind and logic and reasoning. And usually the literary movement, as you'll see when we study the other ones in here, is often a reaction to the previous one. And so Romanticism in many ways was a reaction against the logical reasoning and rationality of the Enlightenment. And so romance provided a conduit then to emotion, spontaneity, imagination, things that the Romantics valued more than logic. And in part, they derived that from those medieval romances and thought those should come back into popularity. So that's how we go from the little r to the big R. The Romantics took this much farther and started to bring in themes like nature and revolution and alienation. And that's why it really became like a movement that, when you look at it, doesn't seem that similar to what we probably think of with romance, getting my wife flowers on Valentine's Day. But I think you can now hopefully kind of see how one grew out of the other. But it's still an important distinction. So what first kind of most important one here is nature. Um, as we saw in Wordsworth's poem in the quiz sample, the Romantics have this special relationship to nature where they have these moments, like Wordsworth imagining he's a cloud and seeing these daffodils that are these transcendent spiritual experiences. They kind of came up with their own word to describe that experience, and they called it sublime. And there's lots of literature out there on the sublime. But this, spirituality is one of the most important things for people, for humans in general, and for romantics, they found their spirituality in nature. So to me, in my understanding of romanticism, that's the most defining trait of romanticism. Revolution, it was a very rebellious time, which I think goes along with the emotions, the imagination, the spontaneity. And so these are all connected. They're very much about doing what you feel in the moment. I should mention real quickly, there was a strong political reaction to this. And so some of the harshest laws were passed during the Romantic period. Another thing, and this is really interesting, is the glorification of the ordinary. So nature, the working class, nature, animals, flowers, etc., had not been the subject of poetry much before this time. Similarly, poetry, drama, writing in general before this time had mainly depicted the upper classes. The lower, the working classes had not really been the subject matter of poetry, but really starting with people like Blake and Wordsworth, who we're looking at in this lesson. Blake's The Chimney Sweeper is probably the best example. You wouldn't have had a poem like The Chimney Sweeper before the Romantic period. And these values of nature, imagination, revolution, emotion, spontaneity, really lead to a poem like The Chimney Sweeper that focuses on the lower class existing. And so that's one of the reasons why I think the Romantic period is important. You also had this darker side of Romanticism that we'll see more when we get later on to the Gothic writers like Byron and Keats and the Shelleys. So this nature can also be a scary thing with tall mountains and thunderstorms. And so it goes the sublime can go to the dark sublime, this other darker extreme. And so you also have the birth of the Gothic genre, which is, totally appropriate for the Romantic period. But you have the birth of the Gothic genre during this time. And so you get ghost stories and things like that. Finally, individualism or alienation. The Romantic period very much focused on the self, internalized things, the mind, psychology. And so they also saw the oppressive, what they viewed as the oppressive governments at the time, as kind of alienating the person. So there's a very big focus on individuality and alienation. All right, a couple last notes here on Romanticism, and then we'll move on to the next part of the literature. You should know for how scholars have studied Romanticism the last 200 years. One really important thing to note is that for a long time, and I'm talking a long time, like until the last 20 or 30 years, Romanticism, for a variety of reasons, we won't have time to go into all of them right now, but Romanticism, for a variety of reasons, was really marked by the study of 6 white guys. Blake, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley, and Keats. To really know the Romantics, to pass an exam on the Romantics, you would just need to know these 6 poets. And they're still considered the biggest figures of Romanticism. As biased and racist and sexist as this seems, all 6 of these authors did make huge contributions, and they rightfully should be studied. But thankfully, in the last 20, 30 years, really starting in the 1980s, scholars have started to go back, study that time period of 1750 to 1850, and find other authors who were female or not white, or from the working class, and see how those authors really embody the values from the last slide and wrote things that are really significant and important. So a few examples specifically of ones we're studying. There are a lot more examples of what I'm talking about here, and we're still studying the most high canonical ones because this is a survey class, and if you don't learn about the major authors, I'd be doing a disservice to you in terms of what this class is helping you learn to prepare you for the future. But we do, thankfully, in our class, have the opportunity to study some of these female authors and other forms of literature, some of them that were overlooked before recently. So Maria Edgeworth, Mary Wollstonecraft, Jane Austen, Mary Wollstonecraft, Shelley. These are a few examples of female authors. We'll talk about Maria Edgeworth later in this very lecture, but she's really someone I think probably a lot of you hadn't heard of. I hadn't heard of her until I studied Romanticism in my PhD. But when you actually read and study Maria Edgeworth, she's so influential to the development of fiction in the novel and so embodies the Romantic values. It's like, how can you not study her alongside Blake and Wordsworth and Coleridge and Byron and Shelley and Keats? Fiction is also a part of it because for a long time, Romanticism was marked by fiction. These 6 white guys above are another thing to know about them is they're poets. None of them were novelists. And so for a long time, people thought of the Romantic period as a period of poetry and the Victorian period as a period of novels. And that's still true in that the 6 most prominent Romantics were poets, and the Victorian period is really marked by the rise of the novel. We'll learn about that soon. But at the same time, there's great Victorian poets, and there's also great romantic novelists and fiction writers. So Edgeworth, I just mentioned how she helped contribute to the birth of the novel, and Sir Walter Scott and Jane Austen are probably the 2 most influential fiction writers before the Victorian period. They're really formative to the rise of the novel. And Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley wrote Frankenstein, for goodness sakes. So fiction is very important to the Romantic period, even if poetry is more important. And we're going to look at fiction from these 4 authors over the next Romantic lessons. And I'm really excited about that because fiction is my personal favorite form. And these are some great stories we get from these people. Finally, drama as another literary form that wasn't considered part of Romanticism. Poetry was the most important in the Romantic period, like I said, but there were some great plays being written at the time, and some more obscure ones I wish we had time to get into here, but the 2 we'll look at are Manfred by Byron and Prometheus Unbound by Shelley. These guys are known for their poetry, but these are some great plays they did, and so we have the opportunity to read them, which is really cool. All right, so now we'll transition to the next part of our lesson. Oh, I forgot to mention the darker side of Romanticism. I just thought I would put up some visuals to kind of illustrate that, since the first visual I had was the lighter side of Romanticism. This is what I think of. The first visual is what I think of with, Wordsworth and poets like him, but this is what I think of with Byron and Shelley and Keats.